Hello, A-Push students. My name is Mr. Chastain, and I'm going to be helping you guys this week basically get caught up with AP US history. You're a little bit behind from where I would want you guys to be this year, but with the help of Mr. Rooks and Mr. Leverage, we're going to at least get you caught up with where you should be by this point in the year. I've taught this course, AP US History, the one you're taking right now. I've taught it for about 14 years. I haven't taught it in a few years because I've been doing IB history. That's where I'll be, you'll see me in 11th and 12th grade, and Mr. Rooks as well. But I'm still pretty knowledgeable about this. I did it for a long, long time, probably almost as old as you guys. I did A-Push for 14 years. So I pretty much know what I'm doing with this. So my job and Mr. Rooks and Mr. Leverage are trying to help you guys get caught up with where you need to be, because when your new teacher comes in here pretty soon, then they can go ahead and get started with everything instead of having to play catch up with you guys. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through this week, the week of the 3rd, September. We're going to go ahead and get you caught up with 3 different videos over the British North American colonies. Again, once your teacher comes in, then you can go ahead and you'll be moving on past this, but you're more than welcome to ask questions to your new teacher, or feel free to ask myself, Mr. Rooks, or Mr. Leverage any questions that you don't understand on this. Again, I've done this for 14 years, so I can really help out, and my plan is, and my goal is, throughout this year, is to be there and be available for you guys for after-school tutorials or any questions that you need to have, so you are successful on the AP exam and also successful on the EOC STAR test that you have to take at the end of this year. So we're going to go ahead and get started with this video. This video is over our first of 3 videos over the British North American colonies. There are 3 different regions that we're going to talk about. We're going to start with the southern colonies. Next video will be New England colonies, and then finally the middle colonies. The southern colonies are broken up into 2 regions, the Chesapeake and Caroline regions. You can see right here. We'll talk about the Chesapeake first, Virginia and Maryland pretty much, and then we'll talk about Carolina, which would be North Carolina and South Carolina in a bit. So the questions to consider when we're thinking about this is, why did England begin colonization in the New World? What were the different types of colonies, which we'll talk about throughout these 3 videos? Why did the English settle here? Why did, particularly the southern colonies, what was it about the colonies that drew them to these places? One of the questions I want you to think about as we're going through here is, how democratic were these colonies? Were these colonies really democratic, or was there a limited form of democracy, or were they democratic at all? And then also specifically with the southern colonies, but we'll talk about climate and geography with the other colonies as well, as how much does that play a role in shaping how these colonies developed, why they developed, particularly what kinds of economies develop in these places, and especially with the southern colonies. And we'll talk a lot about this, and you will talk a lot about this, and your teacher will go over this with you throughout the course, the role of slavery, the development of slavery, and how much it fundamentally changed and altered the course of what will be eventually the United States. And we'll talk about that original sin of slavery throughout the course. So again, English colonization, I'm going to go through a lot of this kind of quickly because I don't want to spend, an hour doing these videos. Nobody wants that. I don't want that. You don't want that. So we're thinking about with English colonization is, why did people come over? Why did the English come over? A lot of them, it's because of the naval power that the English have now had after their victory of the Spanish Armada in 1588. These are a lot of poorer people, landless whites in England who don't have a lot of opportunity. So they see the southern colonies, they see the colonies in general, the English, British North American colonies, they see these places as opportunities. A lot of times, especially in the South, a lot of these were rich sons who didn't inherit land because they were the second son or third son rather than the first son. So instead of inherit land in England, they would just end up, their father who's rich would be like, I'll give you some land over there. And now they have land in the colonies. So it was a way to kind of get them out of their father's hair. And then also they have this land that they can exploit in the Americas. And then one of the things that also helped ease the financial burden to bring people over to the colonies was something called joint stock companies. It cost a lot of money, which is why, again, a lot of rich guys, said, hey, son, you're not going to inherit land, so go over here. It costs a lot of money for people to come over to the colonies. So if you are more than basically an average person, then the fact that, you know, you just didn't have the ability to do that. So joint stock companies allowed for people to pool their monies together to form a company and then to eventually settle an area. They'd buy the land and then they would go together and they would settle that land looking for economic opportunity. The first really big one is going to be in Virginia, and that's going to be part of what we call, again, the Chesapeake Colonies. The Virginia colony is the first one, and it's the first real English settlement is 1607 in Jamestown. This is going to be one of those important things you got to know. One of those dates that you got to know is 1607. The Virginia Company brought over prospective buyers and settlers to bring them over to settle Jamestown. The problem was that a lot of those people weren't farmers that they brought over. A lot of those people were people looking for gold, and you can't eat gold. So unfortunately for the Jamestown settlers, they struggled a lot. The struggle was indeed real. They died of starvation because, again, they were looking for gold rather than, you know, planting for food, which again would seem like would be a pretty obvious thing, yet they didn't do that. So they died from starvation. They also had conflict with Native Americans as well. It took a guy named John Smith to kind of get them into shape and to get them to start, growing food to eat, so they wouldn't go through another starvation times. John Smith and John Rolfe both are going to be instrumental in making Jamestown a more profitable company, particularly with the growing of tobacco, which we'll talk about in a second. You'll of course probably also know the Jamestown settlement from the story of Pocahontas. The real story of Pocahontas is really in depth. I'm not going to go into it right now because, again, it would take a lot of time, and I want you to get through the most important things. If you're really interested to know what the real story of Pocahontas, I'll tell you. But let's just say it's there's really no colors of the wind in this story. It's a pretty tragic story for Pocahontas. That's actually a real picture of Pocahontas right there. Again, if you want a backstory of why she's dressed like this and why, again, her story is really tragic, I'd be more than happy to come find me in my classroom 211, and I'd be more than happy than go over that with you. But eventually the Jamestown settlers are going to get their act together and begin to make the colony profitable. This then Virginia itself will grow larger, Jamestown, and then the colony of Virginia will grow larger. And this is going to lead to eventually the establishment in 1619 of something called the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was basically the first real representative government in the English colonies. This is where people within the colony would vote on elected representatives who would then meet at this House of Burgesses, where they would then vote on laws and pass things like that. So pass laws. This sounds really great because it's like, oh, wow, we can already see the early forms of democracy forming in these colonies. Yet, and this is, again, the thing that we're going to talk a lot about, is that it wasn't much of a democracy. Nah, you had to be a white, male, landowning person to actually vote and have any power in this House of Burgesses. So yes, there is an early form of democracy where people are voting on representatives, and woo, that's great. But then also, like, it really wasn't much of a democracy, because if you didn't fall into one of those categories, then you couldn't actually have any sort of political power. So that leaves out, obviously, Native Americans, eventually African Americans, and women, of course, which again is a large group of people who are going to be left out of that. So early form of democracy, sure. Full democracy, nowhere near that. Maryland is the next place that's going to be established. That's going to be created by a guy named Lord Baltimore, who eventually the city of Baltimore will be named after. He created this as a place for Catholics to be able to go and seek refuge. Catholics were persecuted in England in the mid-1600s, so this was a place for Catholics such as Lord Baltimore to be able to go to a place where they're not going to be persecuted by the Protestant English. In fact, in 1649, Maryland's going to pass something called the Act of Toleration, which will grant religious freedom for all Christians. Not all religions, but all Christians, which again is a really big deal, because much like the House of Burgesses, we're starting to see the seeds of that kind of early ideas of what will be the United States: representative democracy, religious freedom. Again, is it fully religious freedom? No, because obviously people, if people weren't Christian, they're going to be persecuted. So it's a kind of early form of that. Unfortunately for the Catholics in Maryland, more and more Protestants will come over there, and they'll eventually overturn that Act of Toleration and begin persecuting the Catholics in Maryland as well. So again, early forms of democracy, but still a long way to go. The big thing to know about in terms of economy with the Chesapeake region is tobacco. Tobacco was a cash crop in the southern colonies. Cash crop means a crop, basically you sell cash, as in you sell for cash. It is not a crop you're going to grow. It is a crop you're going to mainly use to make money. So whereas subsistence farming is farming that you are growing to eat, to sustain yourself for food, cash crops are simply so that way you can make money. And tobacco was the big money maker. Turns out that those Europeans really liked their tobacco a lot. It helps that it's really addicting, so that just means more people are going to want to buy it. Everything by the 1600s, 1700s, everything in Virginia and Maryland is going to revolve around tobacco. All of it, the whole economy, the whole society is going to be revolve around tobacco, and this massive economic point of Maryland and Virginia is going to then influence other aspects within Virginia and Maryland in Southern colony society in general. Also with the South, very high death rates because of the fact that the climate is terrible. I mean, it's really hot there, and there's a lot of diseases, and a lot of the people that were coming over weren't used to that heat nor had any immunity towards those diseases. So one of the things that Virginia, Maryland, and other plantation owners in the South are going to struggle with is you have these giant fields of tobacco or whatever they're going to grow, but you don't have a stable labor force. That labor force is going to die on you, which is why a lot of planters, a lot of rich planters who own these giant acres of land are going to end up turning to something called indentured servitude. Indentured servitude was basically you came over to the colonies, you signed a contract for 4 to 7 years to basically work for whoever the person that paid for you. Sign that contract, they pay for your passage over here. Remember, I told you the passage over to the colonies was very expensive, so most people couldn't afford that. So you basically signed away 4 to 7 years of your life to work on these plantations. And it was brutal, back-breaking work. Most, or if not most, at least a chunk of those indentured servants that signed away their life for 4 to 7 years never made it to the end of that contract. They would die beforehand, either just because of the hard work, the climate, the diseases, all of those things. So what that meant is that this was a workforce that wasn't always very stable. And the colonial governments of Virginia and Maryland encouraged rich plantation owners to bring people over here, something called the head right system. Bring people over here. We'll give you, if you rich plantation owner bring more and more people over here to work the fields, we'll give you more and more land. So this is a way to encourage immigration. The problem is that, again, the indentured servants didn't last that long. They died well before their end of their contract. If they somehow did make it past their contract, then a lot of them were promised land. A lot of them would assume that you would, at the end of that, because at the end of the contract, you were supposed to get land for your 4 to 7 years. You're supposed to get some land so that you can farm your own land. A lot of those indentured servants didn't end up getting land. The colonial government of Virginia said, well, actually, we don't have any of that land. We gave it to Native Americans. We gave it to somebody else. So a lot of indentured servants, those that did make it past it, were mad. And in the late 1600s, they rebel against the colonial government, led by a guy named Nathaniel Bacon. They're going to rebel against the colonial government as being angry that they weren't given the land they were promised, that they weren't given the rights they were promised, having served their time. Because again, these are a bunch of poorer people. This rebellion doesn't work. The rich land plantation owners are able to pool enough money and weapons and stuff like that to stop this rebellion. But what this rebellion does do is it shows those rich plantation owners that, oh, we can't rely on indentured servants, because not only will they die beforehand, but if they do get to their end of their contract, then they're gonna cause us problems, and they're gonna rebel, and they're gonna want their land and stuff, and we don't want to give these poor people their land. So this is going to lead a lot of plantation owners to say, maybe indentured servants isn't the right way to go. Indentured servitude, maybe the right way to go is African slavery. And we're going to talk more about African slavery. We'll talk about it in another video. Mr. Levers is going to talk a little about African slavery. And then you'll also talk about African slavery a lot more, not only with your new teacher, but just throughout the year. Because again, there's not much more that's more fundamentally shaping the United States than slavery, and obviously in a terrible way, but it's going to shape the country for 400 years. So when the first African slaves first African enslaved are forcibly brought over in 1619, That's going to create a labor force that's going to grow and grow. And we'll talk more about that, especially when we get into the fact that not only is a slave enslaved for their life, but their children, their children's children. So this is going to create that stable workforce, unfortunately, at the expense of African Americans who will be enslaved in this. Again, this is a topic we'll talk a lot about throughout the year. Finally, the last part, the Carolinas, South and North Carolina. South Carolina's main cash crop was not tobacco, it was rice and indigo. Many people from South Carolina, originally English people who originally, before they came from England, they came from the West Indies. English people went to the West Indies, which is in the Caribbean. They brought with them African slavery, and then they decided, well, West Indies isn't for them. We're going to move to these new colonies in the Carolinas, and they brought with them the institution of slavery. So slavery is going to be, again, a big part of not just Virginia and Maryland, but of the Carolinas as well, particularly South Carolina. Not so much North Carolina. North Carolina's main cash crop was tobacco. North Carolina relied less on slavery, not that there wasn't slavery there, but less on slavery. And North Carolina tended to be a lot more independent and very distrustful of authority. So North Carolina kind of sees itself as going its own way rather than a lot of the other colonies who are, supposed to do what they're told. Finally, the last part on here that I want you to know in terms of the overall main idea of the Southern colonies is the fact that their economy is based on a single cash crop, whether that's tobacco in Maryland and Virginia and North Carolina, or rice and indigo in South Carolina. Single men made the majority. Most of the people coming over to the Southern colonies were single men. So there was a lack of women in the Southern colonies, which is going to cause a lot of problems in the Southern colonies, because then that means that, there's no wives there. They do some work or to have babies and things like that. So mainly the people coming over to the Southern colonies were single men looking for opportunity and wealth. High mortality rates, as I mentioned before, high disease rates. The people in the in the Southern colonies didn't last that long. Their life expectancy was very small. Small family sizes too. So again, this is going to be contrasted to some of the other places. We'll talk about the other two colonies, small family sizes. So those families that were able to be created in the Southern colonies tended to be very small. Spread out farms. There's not a lot of towns in the Southern colonies. You have all these farmers who are spread out throughout the colony. So not a lot of farming, not a lot of towns in this place, which means there's not a lot of tight-knit communities. Everybody's kind of separated into their farms, whether that's a big farm like a plantation, which only a small percentage of Southerners had these big plantations, the big farms like we think of. Most Southerners were small farmers who probably didn't own any slaves, but benefited from the slave system, which again we'll talk about another point. So very few community services. There weren't a lot of churches. There weren't a lot of schools, which means education in the Southern colonies wasn't very emphasized in the Southern colonies as it might be in the New England colonies. And then the last one on there, it's aristocratic. That aristocratic, if you don't know what that means, it means that the people that held the power were the rich landowning elite. Those were the people that held power socially, politically, economically. It was the rich plantation owners. Even though they only make up a tiny percentage of the population, they have pretty much all the power in the region. So those are the major points of understanding the Southern colonies. I appreciate you guys listening to this. Again, if you have questions for me, my room is room 211. Please feel free to come by and ask me any questions that you might have. Thank you. Bye.